Welcome to the Podunk Polymath, a podcast dedicated to the sentiments of a secular, sarcastic, screwed-up Southern SJW and skeptic. I'm your host, Chris. Come on in. This is episode 64 of the Podunk Polymath podcast. Thanks again for joining me. Hope y'all had 2 weeks. Great, because I wasn't here last week because, well, mental things. So, you know, depression's a bitch. Oh, I'm sorry. That's probably... Depression sucks, and it's not enjoyable. So, I'm sure many of y'all know that, and I don't need to explain further. But it was needed. So anyway, I'm back. On the pre-ramble, the first thing I wanted to mention was the victory of Doug Jones over Roy the Molester Moore in the Alabama special election for senator, U.S. Senator. It was 1.5% difference. It was not many points. Frankly, I am surprised it happened. And I'm happy, don't get me wrong. However, the fact that half of the people in Alabama voted for a child molester still does not make me happy. But Alabama being what it is, what can one expect? However, there is going to be a Democrat in the Senate for the first time in like 30 years. Now, granted, it's only going to be until the midterms, which is like next year. So it's a toss-up. I don't even know if they're going to be able to keep the seat, to be honest with you. But we have it for a little while, so it's not all bad, I guess. Now, Doug Jones, of course, is not... I mean, I wouldn't consider him a progressive. He's a Southern Democrat, and he probably follows a neoliberal agenda, but, you know, you can't have everything, I reckon. He did help put away some people who bombed, I think it was the Birmingham... I don't know if it was a Birmingham bombing, but it was a bombing, I think, in Birmingham, so during the Civil Rights era, I think. I don't remember. But he's a good guy. He's just, you know, the typical, you know, economic bullshit and social liberal and economically, fiscally conservative, I guess you could say. But anyway, Roy Moore still has not conceded. He is waiting on a sign from God, apparently, and he refuses to concede. And he's trying to make a crusade out of this. Mike Huckabee, former Arkansas governor, even told him that he needed to move on. So if you got the huckster telling you need to move on, maybe you need to move on. I'm just saying. So anyway, congratulations, Alabama. Enjoy it while you can, because I hate to say it, but they're going to take it back. The Republicans are going to take it back in 18. Oh, well. You got to take your victories so we can get them in the South. As me and Alex spoke of last week, it's difficult to get anything resembling anything liberal through in the South, much less progressive. So, small victories. And the Southerners are there. There are people out there. I mean, they knocked on a hell of a lot of doors for that campaign. So that's what happened. What needs to happen is we just got to get out there and make a splash, make ourselves heard. I shared a link from Stephanie Zvon that gave links to a bunch of organizations that are doing just that. So I think I shared it on my page. I know I shared my personal profile, but I can't remember. But I'll try to make sure to do it on there as well. Also, I wanted to mention that I saw Star Wars. No spoilers. Good movie. Star Wars movie. Of course, if you've seen Star Wars movies as many times as I have, of course, there's themes that are rehashed, and it's a Star Wars movie, of course, and there's just certain things that you expect, and maybe it's not surprising as it was when I first saw it 30 years ago, but hey, it's still a good movie. As a standalone movie, it was a great movie, lots of action, lots of spiritual stuff. I don't want to give any spoilers, but it was a good movie. What tore me up was seeing Carrie Fisher, and of course, at the end of the movie, they had a little, in the end credits, they had a thing, and a memoriam to her, so I cried, I'd be honest with you. Before I left the theater, I had to pull it together. So, for a lot of us, Carrie Fisher / Princess Leia was important, especially women. She was a role model for strong women, for a lot of women that grew up then and also now even, so, as you've seen on those t-shirts. So, yeah, it was kind of sad, but it was a good movie, and it was a good one for her to go out on, I think, so. Anyway, I don't want to get too emotional on that one, but you know what I'm saying. On the palaver this week, I have with me a friend of mine, Kevin Watson. No, he's not related. I met him through previous guest, Astrid/Ash Isley, that of the sex work episode, and we were talking about political / economic systems that us humans seem to make in order to live together, whatever you want to say. So it's an interesting conversation. I wanted to have this conversation mostly because I wanted to find out what these things like fascism we keep hearing about, and communism and socialism. We seem to be hearing all these terms bandied about, but I don't think we actually know what it means. And there's a lot of rancor and a lot of bias involved, and I want to try to get as much as possible an objective look at it. So it's very informative. Might get bogged down in a little details maybe, but it's an interesting conversation about this topic. So I hope y'all enjoy it, and sorry for skipping a week.
I'm Jenica.
And I'm Patrick of Real Life Beyond Faith.
And we are a formerly Christian,
currently atheist couple
who take a deep dive into the experience of life after deconversion.
Join us weekly as we talk about topics relating to the journey out of religion.
And interview guests who have their own unique stories to tell.
Look for us on Facebook, Twitter, iTunes, Stitcher,
and anywhere else you can find your favorite podcasts.
Has In God We Trust invaded your town? Are you tired of government officials who want to plaster In God We Trust on taxpayer-owned property? Are you afraid because your local sheriff placed an In God We Trust decal on the patrol cars? We are here to help. The Original Motto Project is for those who feel the separation of church and state is an important issue and should be honored regardless of your belief or lack thereof. Theists, non-theists, and all free thinkers are welcome. We need your support to show politicians that diversity exists within our nation, and their promotion of a monotheistic religion and push for theocracy will not be tolerated. Stand up and be heard. Join us at originalmotto.us.
Welcome to another edition of the Palaver here in the Podunk Polymath Podcast. This week I have one of the moderators of the Science Enthusiast group, and apparently he is also Spock, or so he says. May I introduce to you Kevin Watson? How's it going, Kevin?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on. We were introduced through a former guest, Astrid, who was on the episode about sex work. And because I kind of asked about anybody who knew about kind of the general theory of certain political systems, I guess you could say. Because I was kind of tired of hearing all the rhetoric, about fascism, socialism, etc.
I'll certainly do the best I can to, help describe those.
Yeah, that's the general idea, because, there's a lot of hyperbole, and, of course, emotions get involved sometimes. People tend to say things that aren't exactly
accurate, true,
fact-driven, let's just say. So,
based in evidence, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that's the general idea here. First of all, let's just kind of get an idea of the general, what people would know political systems, first of all.
Okay. Well, so there's one distinction I want to make right out the gate, which is there's a difference between a political system and an economic system. And so that's one of the things where I think people conflate a lot. A political system is, you have your typical, range from pure popular democracy all the way through, authoritarian dictatorship and everything in between. The U.S., as I'm guessing most people know, is a representative democracy wherein we elect people to represent us in the legislative bodies, and they're the ones who truly make the decisions about what laws get passed and things of that nature. This is in contrast to economic systems. So most people will be familiar with the system that the majority or probably the entirety of the developed world is familiar with, capitalism. This is a system in which individuals who have a lot of money, i.e. what some political and economic scholars will refer to as capital, these are the ones. So people have large amounts of this. They're able to use that in certain ways. Usually they use that to influence what is sometimes referred to as the means of production. Basically, anything that allows you to produce a product or service, and then usually they hire people as labor who work for them, who produce the things that they then sell, and the difference between what they spend to make the product and what they sell the product for is profit. This is in contrast to forms of economic production such as socialism or communism, which are similar in a couple of different ways. There's a bit of distinction, but they both share the basic idea that rather than wealthy individuals owning the means of production. It is the workers themselves who, because they create the value that under the capitalist mode of production is the source of profit and therefore the source of kind of the gains of that system, because it's the workers who create that. It is the workers who deserve to control that and who deserve to more specifically benefit from those profits. So the idea is that instead of, a boss who owns the factory, and this is kind of an outdated example, but it can be morphed to anything that's a little bit more modern. Instead of a boss who owns the factory, hires workers, and then sells the products that the workers make, it is the workers who collectively own the factory. They still make the product, they still get paid, but the way in which they are paid is more fair because it takes into account the fact that they are the ones who created that value in the first place, and therefore they get an appropriate share of that based on the value they produced. So it's less of a market-based labor system wherein, it's essentially a monopsony. So you have a small number of people buying the product, and it becomes more and more of an economic democracy, as it were, where people collectively make the choice on how much money they make, what to reinvest back into the company, what products to make, how much of it to make, etc.
I wanted to kind of clarify. You used a word with monopsony. Is that what it was? So
a monopsony is kind of the ideological opposite of a monopoly. A monopoly is where you have one company or maybe a very small number of companies, which would be a duopoly, or, if it's, three companies, I'm not actually sure what that's called. But basically you have very few people selling a particular product. So like a good example of this in the U.S. right now is the airplane manufacturing business, where really the only two companies who make airplanes in any large amount are Boeing and Airbus. There's a few smaller ones around, but they don't make commercial airliners like Boeing and Airbus do. So they're essentially a duopoly. They're the only two places from which you can buy commercial aircraft. And because of that, they control the supply. When you control the supply, you have a very large amount of power in determining what the cost of your product is. By contrast, a monopsony is one wherein there is only a very small or single buyer of a particular good or service. So in the labor market, you have a lot of people who are looking for work, but you have a relatively much smaller group of companies who are able to purchase that labor. And so you end up with in an unbalanced system wherein the ideals of a market economy start to break down, where you get a small number of people buying the labor that you need to sell because you need to keep yourself alive, and therefore they have a disproportionate amount of control over how much you are paid. And the only real thing that controls that is what everyone else is willing to pay. But because that's such a small number of people, they can, or entities, I guess would be a better word for it, they have a lot more control over that. And because, labor is something that is really the only thing that people have to reliably sell to gain the resources needed to feed themselves and house themselves and clothe themselves, etc., they are kind of handed the short end of the stick in terms of what their labor actually ends up being worth in the real world, as it were, and so they kind of take whatever they can get because they need to continue living.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you're,
anyone who's worked in part-time food service labor or anything like that knows very well what I'm talking about, especially if you're a person who has to work 2, 3, 4 jobs just to survive. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Just kind of popped in my head.
No, I work 2 jobs, so I know exactly what you're saying. So let me kind of get you to kind of if you were to give a brief synopsis of each of the major systems. Like if you were forced to maybe, I know of course that it's overly simplifying it, of course, but capitalism, socialism, communism.
So let's see if I can break this down into 2-sentence descriptions. Capitalism, wealthy get wealthier, poor people get poorer, and it's the wealthy who have all the power, and therefore they have a self-interested motive to keep it that way. Socialism and communism both, although I'll go into some quick differences. Socialism and communism both, workers' own means of production collectively and democratically decide who gets paid what, and usually it's structured such that, you work as much as you're able and you receive as much as you need. The communist version of things goes a little bit farther in that, the ultimate goal of communism is essentially no state, no class, no money. Everyone lives in a stateless, classless, moneyless society where everyone is, for all intents and purposes, equal. No one suffers for want or need or goes hungry or starves or dies because they can't get access to medical care. And, you've probably heard the old phrase, no gods, no masters, and that's kind of where communism comes from. And I do kind of want to separate that out from what a lot of people think of when they think of communism, which is Soviet Russia, communist China. Those were very bad examples of what the really original idea of communism was intended to be. But that's a lot more nuanced than, I'm really super educated in, and I'll try and give what detail I can if it comes up later. But, it's something where, my own knowledge is pretty limited.
I've actually studied up a little bit on what you're, and I'm glad you mentioned Soviet Russia and Communist China being kind of outliers, because from what I understand of communist theory, it's like you said. Of course, it's with most systems like this, they're utopian. They're never going to come to pass because humans are evolved, right? And they screw everything up. So, I mean. But I thought Marx, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, that he was kind of like, he was cool with it or something. Did I?
If I recall correctly, and I mean, to do a quick Google search, I thought he was dead. Let me just check.
Wait,
I could be wrong here. Let me just verify that. Yeah, he died in 1883. The Bolshevik Revolution happened in 1917. So, roughly 34 years after he died.
Oh, so I fucked up. Well, that's not...
It happens. Limitations of knowledge. It very well could have been me on the other side of that, but I knew he wrote his most seminal works in the mid-19th century, so it seemed unlikely that he had lived that long.
Well, unless he's like Rasputin, who, supposed
motherfucker live forever.
You try to kill him like 100 times, he won't die. Anyway, that's a whole different story. So, okay, I fucked up there. So,
it happens.
But yeah, it was about as far as you can get. Well, not as far. From what I understand, they try to utilize what was called a vanguard party to try to usher things along, but.
Well, so that's the thing about revolution, and this is getting into some pretty core disputes among the leftist community. The thing about revolutions is that they can be great, but they can also go horribly wrong super easily, because one of the things about revolutions is they sort of rely on mob mentality. And, most people will see that as a bad thing. It's heavily context dependent in my opinion, but I'd say probably more often than not it does end up hurting more than it helps. But the other thing about mob mentality is it very easily leads or opens itself up to co-option by a charismatic figure. And if that charismatic figure is, not a great guy as it might be, then you end up with situations where, it goes south real fast. And the thing about it is, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a, quote unquote bad guy to begin with, because, power corrupts, unfortunately. And even if you're not seeking power, it can be thrust upon you real fast if you happen to be the guy who knows what to say and when to say it, and you have a bunch of people that are really ready to listen, and that can go to your head real quick. So, in my own opinion, while I think Lenin started out as a man who thought he was doing the best for everyone, that he kind of led in revolution, I think he kind of turned out to be one of those people who was very quickly corrupted by the power that he may or may not have sought, and then was passed on to Stalin, who, other than the most severe authoritarian communist, most people on the left realized, yeah, he was kind of a fucked up dude.
Yeah, let's not get too far in the weeds, because I could probably, because I know a little bit. Of course, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So, anyway, so we've got kind of an idea. Oh, also, I wanted to ask, I got so many things. You said there was a distinction between economic systems and political systems.
Yeah. So there is I would say a fairly popular test online, the political compass. So it essentially divides your political views along two different axes. The x-axis is your typical left-right, economic axis. It depends. It largely measures how far you are into either the communist or capitalist camp, or the various things in between, which include a very wide range of things from liberal capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, social democracy, etc. So it kind of plots you there, and then it also goes from authoritarian to libertarian. And so this is more of your your social governmental axis. It's essentially how much you think the government or any ruling body should have control over the society over which they kind of sit. And so at the very top you have, mass authoritarians, and, you've got Hitler, Pol Pot, Mao, Stalin, etc. And at the very bottom, well, you don't really have leaders because it's the anarchist side of things, and, they're very into, no one leads us, we lead ourselves. So you don't really get many anarchist icons just due to the very nature of what anarchism is. And so, you'll probably hear a lot of rhetoric from the Republicans, less government, less government, less government. Of course, their actions kind of betray them on that point, but then you actually have the libertarians who do honestly believe in less government, and, they actually see that as, less control over an individual's life. And so you get that kind of access, and you can get people all over the spectrum on that. And, people from all over the spectrum exist in the world in, some proportion or another. But what you're going to find in most democracies these days, and I'm not just talking about the US, but this is also true throughout most of Europe, Australia, basically what you would consider the quote unquote Western world, much as I despise that term, is going to be, liberal democracies where they're probably going to be a little bit above the midline on the authoritarian, libertarian bit, because they do believe in, I wouldn't say fairly heavy, but decently heavy government control over things like, providing roads and police and firefighters, etc. And then, you're generally going to find them a little bit more to the right side of things, because even, the most liberal progressives out there generally still support capitalism. They just want it a bit more controlled. And so, you're generally going to find most of your politicians in a, decently sized swath closer to the upper right corner than anywhere else. And so that's kind of where that division comes in. So when people think communism, they think Russia, or the Soviet Union, they think China, and those were better examples of authoritarian regimes rather than communist regimes, because, as I mentioned earlier, communism not really about regimes, versus more. Well, there haven't really been more libertarian or anarchistic states, because anarchism again doesn't really lend itself to a state, but you could think of places, various countries in Africa or the Middle East who have, very destabilized governments, or places where, central authority really isn't a thing, and so you end up with a lot of communities that kind of rule themselves because the central government not really doing much with them, or if anything, they're abusing or mistreating them in some way. But by and large, they tend to kind of govern themselves in their own ways. And I think a really good example of this right now is the Rojava region in northern Syria, where the and I've now forgotten the name of the group that's up there. I want to say the Kurds. I think that's right. Anyways, the people in that region have, due to the destabilization of the Syrian government and the various conflicts going on there, have kind of reorganized themselves into their own democratically led community. And surprisingly for the region, they've got things like gender equality and a lot of other attributes that you would be hard pressed to find in the region in general, and even in some of the more developed world, because they've managed to actually cobble together a system that works pretty well and allows their people the freedom to live their lives and create a decently stable society in what is an incredibly unstable region, for that matter. So it's very surprising and impressive what they've been able to achieve through a more direct democracy style system. But I've kind of gotten off into a tangent, as I want to do.
I took the test you're talking about, or whatever, at the Axis. Or I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'd forgotten all about that.
Yeah, in fact, I don't remember the exact website, but I'm sure you can put it in the show notes.
Yeah, politicalcompass.org, I think was the name of it, where I found the thing where you do the axis. Yeah, I fell on the Kropotkin. Is that his name, Kropotkin? I can't remember exactly how to pronounce it. Which Anarchosyndicalism seemed to be the thing I fell under, and actually read a little treatise on it or whatever, just to see what it was about. And I thought it was.
And probably specifically to anarcho-syndicalism, I'm guessing some of your listeners might be familiar with a man by the name of Noam Chomsky. He's a linguist out of MIT, but he does a lot of writing and thinking about these sorts of systems, and specifically supports anarcho-syndicalism. And that's getting a little bit deeper into the weeds of this than I'm probably prepared to go at the moment. That requires some pretty hardcore research on my side to be able to speak about with any sort of education or academic knowledge.
Yeah.
But yeah, so for instance, I don't know exactly what the label this particular one is, but my economic left-right was negative 7.88, which puts me pretty far to the left, and the social libertarian / authoritarian was minus 7.08, which puts me pretty close to the libertarian side of things. So for that reason, I kind of consider myself a libertarian socialist, even though I'm not sure if that particular label precisely fits me, but there's a lot of diversity of thought on the left anyway. So, labels are, while sometimes useful, kind of more semantic than anything.
Well, I'm glad, actually. I forgot to ask you what your leaning was, so we could kind of have that basis when we spoke to begin with, so we could see maybe what your bias was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I don't deny that I've got a pretty left-leaning bias, but I've made a lot of transitions in my life over, regarding my own political affiliations. Back when I was, early in college, I was growing up in the far northern end of California, a very conservative region, and kind of considered myself sort of a soft Republican. That was before I really had any idea what Republicans were all about, and kind of got away from that fairly quickly once I had a better idea of it. But at the same time, I did have a lot of that influence, and it definitely took a while of just kind of educating myself and learning before I kind of got pushed farther to the left. But I'd say before the Bernie Sanders campaign, I would have considered myself a solid typical progressive. I've just been pushed farther left due to a number of things over the last year and a half to 2 years.
Fair enough. So let's we got the background and everything. We got kind of the basic systems down.
Yeah.
Let's kind of fast forward to present day.
Sure.
What the fuck is going on, man?
That's a complicated question.
Okay. First of all, let's kind of get our terms down. What the fuck is fascism?
All right, so fascism is specifically a form of authoritarian nationalism. The idea behind it, and this is coming from a description of an actual fascist that I've talked to, via the good old interwebs, and I'm part of a political debate group chat with people from all different persuasions, just kind of in an effort to not delude myself or get caught in that echo chamber. So the idea behind fascism as it was described to me, mind you, I don't necessarily agree with all of the characterizations, but I'll try and give it in the most even-mannered way I'm capable, is basically you have the idea of the nation where you have a group of people in it and you are trying to do the best thing for the nation as a whole as you can. Granted, it comes up to questions of who decides, A, what the nation counts as, B, what counts as being good for the nation, and C, where those decisions come from and how they're enacted. So it's got a lot of questions surrounding it, but the basic idea is, fascists don't necessarily want, or, I wouldn't necessarily consider them any more, and I hate to use this word because I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, any more evil than anyone else. They're just in a place where they're very easy, in my view, to manipulate into a mob mentality of, this good, this bad, and, you get the wrong kind of leader, which unfortunately we as a race seem to be quite prone to, and you end up with a situation where, hey, Jews and black people are bad, we should kill them. And unfortunately that's what happened in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and so you end up with some unfortunate I don't want to call them side effects because they're sort of built in, but side effects. The other thing about fascism is it tends to be very pro-capitalism. One of the things you'll often see, and it's very much a straw man / basically outright lie, is that the Nazi Party started as the National Socialist Democratic Workers' Party, or I don't know what the actual term is in German, but the abbreviation was NSDAP. So from that, a lot of people get this false idea that the Nazis were in some way socialist. That is more or less a complete lie. To be fair, Hitler wasn't all that great about capitalism, but in the end, when he actually had power, he was turning over, resources which had been nationalized by the Bundestag up to that point to, private companies. So, he may have spoken out a bit about capitalism, but he fed right into it when he actually took power. So, dissuade yourselves, if you're listening, of the notion that Nazis were ever socialist in any honest definition of the term. And now I've lost my train of thought entirely and forgot what the question was.
What the fuck is fascism, which I think you pretty much answered.
Okay, yeah. So, and obviously there's going to be a lot of places where if you're really curious, you can go online and find out more about it. But it's typically a very far right authoritarian nationalist system. And as we all know, nationalism is, this idea that, above and beyond your, general everyday garden variety patriotism, it's, my nation is the best, everyone else sucks, and we should spread ourselves to improve them. And it's kind of modern colonialism, everyone else is a bunch of savages that we need to educate and reform, and anyone who refuses to go along with this, well, they're not worth our time. And therefore they are just burdens to us and should be exterminated. Mind you, I'm going a little heavy into the leftist rhetoric there, so feel free to ignore any of the very obviously biased bullshit coming out of my mouth. But I think the general description is decently accurate, and my major concerns with fascism are exactly as I mentioned earlier. It's super easy to manipulate into an extremely immoral, unethical system so fast.
Yeah, so I agree with your leftist bent anyway, so I'm not going to challenge you on that. I did want interject a bit, as I recall, the word fascism comes from, is it Latin fasci? Is that right?
So the word fascist comes from the Latin fascisti, which was specifically it was essentially an ancient axe. It was a bundle of sticks wrapped by tweed or twine or something, usually with a blade attached, and so it was actually a weapon that some of the Roman centurions would use during combat. And it's been used as a symbol of strength in a lot of places, and specifically the fascist movement of early 20th century Italy used it heavily as a symbol, and technically it was used as a symbol of strength even before that. In fact, to this very day, if you go to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., on the armrests of the giant statue of Lincoln, you will see fascisti sitting there. And sometimes in American iconography, you will see an eagle in one hand holding an olive branch and the other not hand, claw, holding one of these fascistis. So it's something that has sort of pervaded our political imagery to the point where most people don't even notice it. That's assuming they even understand the root of the word fascist to begin with. So it's designed as a symbol of strength, and in my opinion worked perfectly for an authoritarian nationalist regime whose entire idea was we need to get ready for war at whatever cost possible.
Very good. And let's kind of come to the point of contact right now at this point. So we have what could be described as neo-Nazis, I guess, and I guess by extension, I guess I want to lump them together as fascist and neo-Nazi. I mean, I don't see really the distinction between the two at this present time in history.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different groups out there that all sort of share, I don't want to say the same, but extremely similar values. And usually those are, at the highest level, support of a white ethno-state. And so, the idea being that, white people, specifically, what they term as the Aryan race, is the superior race to all others, and therefore, should be ruling over all the others because they are the best. Despite having any scientific, logical, rational, empirical evidence for this claim, that's what they believe. And so you'll find, this particular ideology put forth in a number of different ways. You have people that tie it into their patriotism and nationalism for the flag, for the anthem, what have you. You will find people that, use symbols from Nazi Germany. They'll use newer symbols to represent, a newer version of that same ideology. And, they will, from time to time take the streets or whatever public spaces they can in support of their message. And usually they will be using the most violent imagery and words possible to inflict a certain amount of terror in their, in the onlookers. I don't necessarily want to confuse that with terrorism, lest some people rip me apart. Granted, not much of an online presence, so hey, if you can find me, come at me. So I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to call them terrorists until and up to the point where they actually start using, physical violence. But the fact is still, despite the fact of direct physical violence from these groups being, largely limited and certainly not present in many, very open formats, they're still preaching violence. They are still looking to incite. Even if it's not an immediate incitement, they are still speaking in ways, often in very coded language, to show that they do believe that, people of color, people that are part of the GSM, the gender and sexual minorities communities, are lesser beings, disabled people, for instance. So, they're looking to kind of attack all of these communities and in one way or another remove them from the conversation. And despite all of their preaching about free speech, it is their ultimate goal to remove those communities, remove from those communities the ability to speak at all in any way. So, they may cower behind the First Amendment and say, well, we have the right to say what we want, but the fact is their speech is really pushing to remove the speech of others, even if they couch that in heavily coded or indirect language.
Very much what you're saying right now is kind of what the early stages of Nazism was.
Yeah.
I recall reading about the first thing they did with disabled people was they gassed them, basically.
Yeah.
And that was kind of
they weren't useful to the country's productions, and they were a drain on resources. So it was largely deemed that their existence was, not useful to the nation or the national good. And this was further spurned by the fact that this whole movement started shortly after the Great Depression. So economic resources were light, and they were able to make that case that much more easily.
And of course, Weimar Germany was, the World War I treaty kind of, was horrible for Germany. It killed them, and they couldn't. They couldn't militarize, and was it the Rhine Valley or whatever? I mean, there was a lot of shit they couldn't pay back their, the war reparations or whatever. So,
yeah, well, their economy had crashed worse than most of Europe, and they due to all the shit that happened in World War I, they were very heavily watched by the surrounding European powers, and that didn't make their economic recovery any easier. So you end up with this charismatic group like the Nazi Party coming along and saying, well, the Jews and the disableds and all these people are what's really hurting our economy, and people are ready as shit to believe that when they're hurting and it's an easy target. So they were ready to accept that as an explanation and help along the changes, put that in giant air quotes, that the Nazi Party had suggested for these problems that they more or less concocted or pointed to as scapegoats.
How much of a threat are they now?
That's a really hard question to answer, mainly because they still tend to be relatively small groups of people. You don't see Nazis on the street every day, or if you do, you have no idea they're there. But they've definitely grown in the last year. The campaign and the election of Trump, who has demonstrated himself multiple times to be an out and out racist, nationalist, piece of shit. They're encouraged and strengthened by his presence, and specifically his presence in the Oval Office, and the fact that he's able to spew that sort of rhetoric day in, day out through his Twitter account, through his official channels, through what have you. And so even if he's not outright supporting them, they still believe that, he's in the White House to help them out. And I don't necessarily think they're wrong about that. It's going to be difficult to, come out and directly support these guys. But when he had the opportunity to outright denounce and, disclaim everything they ever said, he went the route of, there's people to blame on both sides, and he went into this false equivalence bullshit. And so, the fact that he is in the White House and passively giving support to these people, or at least they view him as giving support to them, that means they are so emboldened right now. There have been more, white supremacist type rallies in the last year than I think I have ever seen on the news. So, the fact that we are seeing this rise in activity from them, not a good sign in my opinion. And they have the political power and obviously the political will to actually make something out of this, and can start getting policies past over time that can actually start to really hurt people. And the Republican Party is not putting up any sort of a fight to that, despite whatever rhetoric they might put out to the contrary. They've become experts at creating covertly racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-disabled people policies for decades now, and they've just become incredibly good at it. And now there is a increasingly larger and more vocal group of people spurning them on. That does not spell anything good for, the groups of people I mentioned or for the country as a whole, in my opinion.
Who's Antifa?
Antifa is not a group. It is a political ideology. It's literally anti-fascism. If you do not like fascism, if you are against fascism, you are Antifa. Now, this goes against what most people will think of as Antifa, which is better termed as, at least as I've heard it, the Black Bloc. And these are the people who dress up in all black, dress up in, put scarves across their face to hide their faces, and they're usually the ones standing in front of counter protesters at these white supremacist rallies, and they're the ones who have taken the stance of these people, the white supremacists, nationalists, what have you, are inherently violent in their speech and are very likely to become violent in their actions as well, especially when they are directly confronted by people who are loudly and vocally opposing them. So they have put themselves in that position to be the targets for violence, so that the more vulnerable populations of the more peaceful protesters don't have to get physically involved. And there is some small number of them who have taken that to a proactive point, which I'm not really going to pass judgment one way or the other on in this conversation, but the number of people who do that, even just if you were only to count the people who would, describe themselves as, Antifa, counter protesters or Black Bloc protesters, is really quite small. And the way the media portrays it is, you see one incident, well, that's the entire movement. And it's the same thing that happened and is happening with Black Lives Matter. So it's one of those situations where, they've drawn the false equivalence because, yeah, there is occasionally some violence, but I would say the vast majority of the violence that you would see the protesters covered in black are engaged in is defensive in nature. They did not start the fights, but they're damn sure going to finish them. And I myself generally support that stance because I agree that where they're coming from is more or less accurate. The white nationalist, neo-fascist protesters that you see are not going to stop at just violent rhetoric. They're going to pump that up to physical rhetoric as soon as they can get away with it, probably sooner if they're stupid.
You answered all my questions. I was about to ask you about tactics, about if the equivalency, like false equivalency and all that. But in the end, can it really, if something is violent at some point, if you beget, what was it? Violence begets violence, basically.
So I'm going to counter that with a quote that I enjoy from Martin Luther King. It was when he was stuck in the Alabama jail, or Montgomery, Alabama jail. And one of the things he said, and forgive me, I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it directly in front of me, was something along the lines of, our greatest stumbling block isn't the Ku Klux Klaner or the whatever else, the other group that I can't remember off the top of my head. Our greatest stumbling block is the white moderate who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, over a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. The idea behind that, and mind you, MLK was himself very into nonviolence, but he understood that direct action was needed to achieve his goals, and that simply, sitting down and, waiting for a more convenient time, as he put it, was simply not a feasible thing. Now, violence can beget violence, but the thing about it is violence faced with nonviolence just ends up with a lot of dead nonviolent protesters. If you have someone who's there and their goal is specifically to kill all who oppose them, it doesn't matter if you have a gun in your hands or not. They're still going to want to kill you because simply for the fact that you do oppose them. And while I respect and generally speaking agree with the people who want to do these counter protests nonviolently, I have to question their rationale in that when you are faced with violence, if you commit to nonviolence, you're going to end up dead. And you may become a martyr, and you may become a forgotten, revolutionary, or worse, considered a traitor because you were on what ended up being the wrong side of history, given that history is written by the victors. So I respect and, I personally have not engaged in violence against the people with whom I disagree. I prefer, I prefer reasoned rhetoric. I prefer to have conversations like we're having right now. But I recognize that there are going to be situations and circumstances where that's simply not possible. You're going to have a gun down your throat, and if you don't have some way to defend yourself, you're going to die. And that's just the unfortunate reality of it. And I know people out there are going to say, I'm overblowing the situations, but I point you to Charlottesville, where, a neo-Nazi decided that, all these counter-protesters who were all being peaceful were not worth their time and decided to take a car and run over a bunch of them. And unfortunately, Heather Heyer got caught in that and lost her life for that cause. And, if that sort of violence ends up scaling up, I don't want to see what happens to the peaceful protesters. And I would rather there be people there who are prepared to, defend violently, if necessary, those peaceful protesters and be able to prevent what happened in Charlottesville and what has likely happened in many other places, that haven't received the same level of media coverage. And, we don't necessarily see fascists and white nationalists going after people on a daily basis, but I'm kind of hoping that the reason they haven't gotten to that point yet is partially due to Antifa. They know there are people out there who will counter them with violence if necessary, and I'm hoping that ends up being a positive thing in preventing them from even trying it in the first place. Sorry, you can probably hear I'm getting a tad bit emotional on this point.
Yeah, your bias is showing, which I'm not,
Yeah, no, I'm incredibly biased on this point, and I won't apologize for that because, despite my bias, I do believe in not giving into false equivalencies and not giving into, the both sides have their problems sort of rhetoric. I'm not going to deny that, my side of things doesn't have problems. It surely does. But I honestly do believe that the other side of this is willing to commit heinous acts of violence to achieve their means. And that's largely because they see that as the best way forward. And, if you truly have that belief, you're going to do what you need to do to make it happen. But this common talking point that, violence on the left makes them as bad as violence on the right, I'm sure, there have been umpteen thousand, rebuttals to that, and I'm probably going to give a repeat of one of them right now. But the people who are targeted by these groups, people who are people of color, people who are part of the GSM community, people who are disabled, they don't get a choice in those classifications, in how they were born, or the, in the case of disabled people, the particular abilities they are lacking. They don't have that choice. They are given that lot in life, and they have to make the best of it. And a lot of times that means going through a lot of suffering. The only thing that you need to not be targeted by an anti-fascist violent protester, don't be a fucking fascist. You have a choice on that ideology. You have a choice to say, these people are not useful in society. You have a choice to say these people deserve to be exterminated or at the very least removed from society. You make that choice consciously with your own mind. You do not get to hide behind, oh, this isn't a choice that I made. This was just something I was born with. No, you do not get that shield. So fascists make that choice for themselves, and they should be held accountable for that choice, especially if that choice leads to action where they are trying to hurt people who do not have a choice about where they got placed in society.
Okay, you're not going to get any pushback. I was playing devil's advocate mostly on that one because
I totally understand, and it's one of those places where a lot of people, and this is a completely different conversation, a lot of people have a misunderstanding of what devil's advocate is, but I appreciate that you brought it up there because it needed to be said. It needs to be said over and over again until people understand that this is a difference between defending people who don't have a choice in who they are and defending people who made the choice to target those people for who they are.
Should you punch a Nazi?
I'm not going to give any moral pushback to anyone who does. Let's just say it that way. I don't know if I could bring myself to do it because I've always been a nonviolent person. I can't push myself to be violent without some pretty heavy in the moment cause. So, if I see someone with a swastika on the street, I'm probably not going to go up and punch them. I probably will confront them. And, if it comes to the choice of defending myself or those around me from them, yeah, I'll probably punch a Nazi. But, I'm not going to condemn anyone who sees someone walking down the street with a fucking swastika armband and just goes up and punches their lights out. I'm not going to pass judgment on them at all. If you didn't want to get punched, don't be a fucking Nazi.
Well, I'm glad at least you're honest about it because a lot of people, okay, what would I call them? Armchair revolutionaries. They sit there and act like they would punch. Motherfucker, you ain't punching shit. Okay. Yeah, I personally wouldn't. I don't have I know people who would, but they're very few to be. Most people I know are like me. Like, I'm just not punching anybody unless my life is in danger or something.
Yeah, and the one thing that I try to pride myself on as much as possible is intellectual honesty. I have my positions. I can usually defend them, to a decent degree, but I'm not gonna sit here and act all tough or macho or whatever, sexist term you want to apply to that particular behavior and say, oh yeah, I would definitely punch a Nazi, because I know I probably wouldn't unless I was faced with a pretty serious situation. And it's a question that a lot of people are going to have trouble answering honestly, because it's a hypothetical. And when you have hypotheticals that specifically that put yourself in a dangerous situation, it's a lot easier to make a choice when you're sitting at your computer typing on the internet, or even, sitting in your living room talking to someone on a podcast, than it is to actually carry out in real life. When someone asks you, what would you do if you had a gun pointed in your face? No one can fucking answer that. Not until the actual moment happens. The blood's rushing, the adrenaline's in your system, affecting your judgment. There are so many biochemical things that go on in your brain at the time of the event. You are never going to be able to predict how you're going to be able to react to that unless you've been in that situation before.
Exactly. So I did want to ask you this as a kind of a hypothetical. Now, I see what you're saying, and I actually asked this question before of other people. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that a revolution is occurring or whatever. Now, from what I've seen from a historical point of view, if a revolution is predicated chiefly on violence, it seems to me it's destined to fail. Now, there's a difference between it being based on violence in the aggregate, to me, and there being violent acts that are committed because they need to be committed. Would you say there's a difference there?
That's a really hard question to answer. Like I said, this goes back to what I was saying just a second ago. It's one of those things that's hard to predict. But I would say that if the situation is dire enough that you've actually gotten a significant portion of the population to support a violent revolution, most likely that didn't happen for no reason. There was probably something that occurred that is, violently or directly harming enough people that, a decent segment of the population got angry about it. And if that's happening, then, unfortunately, the only thing that can stop violence is violence. As much as I know a lot of people are going to disagree with that, I don't think, I stand behind my belief that facing violence with nonviolence doesn't do shit. So if it is to stop an active violence against people, whether that be, removing money from, health care to the point where people are dying, or, on the other end of the spectrum, if you've got martial law on the streets, and they're actively executing people who go against the state, violence does need to be employed there. And other than that, though, I do still have some faith in, electoral politics, and I'm sure a lot of people to my left would say that's misplaced, and that very well may be the case. I'm not yet to that point where I can say it's completely useless, though. I do believe in a pragmatic sense of, what's the word I'm looking for? Violence prevention. I'm sure there's a better term for that, but basically making sure people are not getting harmed in the moment, doing what you can to prevent it from occurring. And if that can be done through electoral changes or changes through our democracy, I am all for that. But if it can't, well, then more drastic measures need to be taken. If those are violent, then so be it. And I can only hope at that point that the violence that we have to employ does not get carried away. And luckily in history, we have examples of both. We had examples, World War II. Once the Nazis were defeated, we actually saw the most peaceful period in history be enacted. Now, that peace didn't necessarily extend to everyone. The Cold War definitely had its own offshoots of actual physical violence, but it certainly became the most peaceful period in European history. And so I do believe that enacting violence to stop violent, immoral behavior can be useful and can come to an end on its own. Unfortunately, there are also other counterexamples to that. So we have to hope that, if such a revolution does occur, that we can stop when we need to stop, and we can start rebuilding and building a better society where everyone can receive what they need and live fulfilling lives.
So we're talking about toss the dice, basically. We don't fucking know either way.
Yeah, it's unfortunately, anyone who says they know what's going to happen is fucking wrong. So
awesome. Well, that's great. I mean,
I know it's not not the most useful or comforting statement to make, but we're humans, we're fallible, we're gonna fuck up. We are really bad at making rational decisions, we're really bad at calculating risks, and all of that is mostly due to the shit it took for us to survive to this point, and the way that our brains have developed in filtering out information. And unfortunately, that makes us surprisingly unpredictable as a species. But I have to hold on to the hope that we can be better and that we will be better, even if I don't live to see it.
I think it's interesting that you're actually optimistic. I myself am not as optimistic. I'm looking for the extinction of the species within the next 200 years, but that's just...
Yeah, well, I mean, special extinction and probably the extinction of most forms of life on the Earth may very well be inevitable, but I am going to let out a dirty little secret that not a lot of people on the internet know about me. I am not an atheist.
What?
Yeah, I know. And, I'm not going to go too much into my own personal theology. It's, the closest, religion you could say I qualify as is Christian, but my own theology is wildly different from most Christians that you're going to find today, be they, more of the liberal or conservative bent. I cannot accept nihilism as a livable philosophy, and therefore I have to have some form of optimism just to live my everyday life. And so it's that's probably the source of where most of that optimism comes from. Is I just can't accept the nihilism of the of defeatism, of saying that, oh well, we're just going to fuck ourselves over anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I've got to be optimistic and say, no, we can do better, and I gotta hope beyond hope that we will do better and try to take action to bring that to pass. I may not live to see the trees of the seeds that I plant, but I gotta hope they cast shade someday.
So, since you disagree with me, obviously you're a Nazi sympathizer. And
clearly, yeah, no. I take a more moderate view on that point. I think you can have a nuanced, moderate perspective and not be a fucking Nazi sympathizer. There in my own internet world community, there was a huge falling out of people in the group that I moderate, the Science Enthusiasts on Facebook. The creator of the group, Dan Broadbent, he's a fairly well-known guy in the science communication and skeptic community. At least I think he is. So, he was all about, punching Nazis is wrong several months ago. And unfortunately, this got him labeled as a Nazi sympathizer. And I think that was just, reactionary nonsense. People are, arguing that the morals of punching Nazis don't stand up to scrutiny is not the same as saying, oh, well, Nazis aren't so bad. It's not the same thing at all. And I do believe that there can exist moderate viewpoints on that subject without needing to be categorized into Nazi puncher or Nazi sympathizer / Nazi. You can have that middle opinion. I don't agree with the middle opinion necessarily, but I understand where it's coming from and can respect it as a valid opinion on the topic. And if you're racing to categorize people into a binary or into a dichotomy of categories, you're wrong. All dichotomies are false dichotomies. And yes, I just made a dichotomy in itself. But I do believe that there is no such thing as a two category and that's it thing, unless you are an electronic signal passing along a wire, and even then you have voltage variance. So, fuck your binary nonsense, and that extends to gender in case you get, in case you care.
Well, I'm an SJW, of course.
Well, my spouse is a non-binary individual, and I have enough thoughts for another podcast episode on that topic, should you ever want to cover it. So, anyways, I don't think there is an easy way to split people into two categories like that. You're fooling yourself if you think there is. Let people have those opinions, unless their opinion is that, you are a person of color, therefore you should not be included in society, or worse, you should be exterminated. That is the only opinion I can say with certainty that, fuck off, that's not an opinion, that's genocidal nonsense, and you, for that opinion, do not deserve to be a part of a society. But, other than that, I try to let people have their opinions so long as they're not hurting people. I'm going to disagree heavily, and, the whole free speech thing is kind of nuanced for me. But, generally speaking, I believe the majority of people are capable of having rational thoughts of, what they believe, and usually can back them up. I know biases are going to get in the way and are going to make those arguments irrational, and people, arguments could and should be made about why they're wrong. But, lumping people into two categories is not the way to go about that.
Okay, so I want to go ahead and just go back a little bit before we wrap up here.
Sure.
The whole thing with Broadbent and the Nazi thing was Dan Arrow. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that right now. There was the Battle of the Dans.
Yep.
I already know about this. And I actually got blocked by Dan Arrow because I dared suggest that, he had black and white thinking. I posted a meme. Well, I was being a little facetious here. I was making fun. I was drunk. Forgive me a little bit. And I was like, hey, I'm your biggest fan, Dan. And it was a picture of everybody who disagrees with me as Hitler. I don't know if you've seen this.
I feel like I have seen that. It's a little whiny kid crying and
well, it's like Hitler sliding down a rainbow. It's like one of those.
There are so many memes on the internet I probably haven't seen, so don't be surprised if I have no clue what you're talking about. But I get the basic gist. And I would I am not the biggest fan of Dan Broadbent myself. He's expressed some less than pleasant opinions in the past. Yes. I'm a moderator of the group because I like the group, not because I like him. But I don't think that the flack he got for what we affectionately called Punchgate in the admin chat for that group, it was really deserved. He expressed an opinion. People disagreed with the opinion. That's fine. But as soon as people got into black and white, you must be a Nazi sympathizer if you think this, sort of thinking, they lost my respect for that.
Yeah, well, okay. I'm glad you said that because I also have some issues with things he said, and sometimes he comes off as a prick to me.
Yeah,
Broadbent does. That's just me. It's a personal opinion.
Yeah,
obviously.
He does unfortunately have a tendency to attract levels of drama, and Punchgate's not the only dramatic thing that the group has gone through in the almost year that I've been on the mod team for it. So I'm not going to defend him. I'm not going to attack him. The most I will say is I don't particularly like him, but I don't think he's an awful person. He has opinions I disagree with, and that's just fine. I'm not going to let that affect the rest of my relationships online unless, those people with whom I have said relationships want it to affect that. And luckily I've been able to, steer clear of most of that. And, if people want to confront me about it, go right ahead. I'm willing to listen and defend my opinions, and, most of all, I'm always open to evidence and logical argument, and if you have a reason you think I'm wrong, please bring it to me. I will gladly talk to you about that.
Okay, well, black and white thinking, I think we can both agree, is kind of fucked up.
Yeah, I will definitely agree with you there.
Yeah, because that was my big thing with Dan Arrow, was his black and white bullshit. Like we were just talking about, either you're a Nazi sympathizer or, you're Antifa or whatever the fuck, I don't even know.
Yep.
Okay, we'll just leave it there.
Sounds
good. So you are the do you have anything to plug other than that? The moderator of the
I run a Facebook page that pretty much no one follows right now called that SJW the Nazis warned you about. It's mostly just a meme dump for me.
I like that.
Yeah. I run a pretty much now inactive Twitter account called Sciapologist. For a while, I was very into arguing with, science deniers on the internet, anti-vaxxers, flat earthers, those sorts of people. I don't do that much anymore, but, I still have the account and I still check it from time to time. So if you want to follow me or ping me there, feel free. Otherwise, not really.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, I wanted to thank you for coming on, and I'm sorry we had a bit of a problem the first time you were supposed to come on.
No worries. I understand. Life gets in the way, man. No big deal.
I was tired as fuck. I'll just be real about it. So, yeah, thanks for coming on and talk to me about this. I thought it was very enlightening, and I hope some people can learn kind of from this, what we're talking about here, especially considering what's going on right now as far as, Antifa and neo-fascist white supremacist groups, kind of get a basis for understanding maybe a little bit.
Yep.
All right, man. Well, again, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate you giving me the time to kind of rant and ramble in my way.
No problem. Well, take care of yourself, okay?
You also, man. Talk to you later.
That'll do for this episode of the Podunk Polymath Podcast. I want to thank Kevin Watson for coming on and talking to me about political and economic systems, for which I was greatly curious, and he was kind enough to come on and kind of give me a rough outline. Of course, these conversations could take forever to talk about, but a brief outline, kind of a Cliff's Notes, if you will, a dummy's guide, even though it's kind of ableist. But anyway, so thanks for coming on and talking to me and maybe informing us and you. Maybe you got informed. Hopefully you did. Of course, if you want to find the show, you can go to thepodunkpolymath.com. Of course, the music is by ... You can go check out their music at cdbaby.com/cd/... The new and improved logo is by Jeff Prebick Jr. on Twitter at PitAtheist. If you want to check me out on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google Plus at Podunk Polymath, check me out there. Email podunk.polymath@gmail.com. If you want to become part of the Patreon posse, which Patreon went back to the old way of doing things after they got so much blowback from trying to fuck up passing the fees on to the people who were being patrons. And they said, oh, anyway, they fucked that up and they put it back the way it was. Anyway, if you want to become part of the posse, you can go to patreon.com/thepodunk-polymath. Call-in phone number is 615-378-POPO-7676. You can join the Podunk Polymath Podcast Posse Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/the Podunk Polymath Podcast Posse, all separated by periods. Of course, if you want to go to the Podunk Polymath Podcast online store, that's zazzle.com/podunk_polymath. Of course, if you look on the sidebar there, you can follow the show on WordPress. You can check out my tweets and follow me on Twitter. A little box there. There's a PayPal donate button. You can subscribe on RSS, Google Play, iTunes, and Stitcher. Of course, there's a Patreon button there. There is a button for you can like the page, the Facebook page, recent posts and recent comments. I did want to mention that I put in for Spotify and iHeartRadio. So I don't know if those things are in yet, but I put in for it. So whether they, I don't know. They said they don't email you, so apparently I'm supposed to guess. I don't know. Anyway, again, sorry about the week off. Oh, I did want to mention that I'm going to start releasing shows on Wednesday now. It'll give me more time to prepare off the weekend because I suck as soon as I get back. I hate coming off the weekend. So Wednesday, it gives me a little more time to kind of get my shit together. So, and plus, I have things going on the weekends now that kind of occupy my time. So I'm going to switch to Wednesday and maybe this kind of things won't happen anymore. And I'm sorry, for taking the week off. I hope y'all understand because sometimes you got to have a little self-care. That's important. Anyway, well, thanks for sticking in there and listening to me and being long-suffering fans of this barely mediocre show. All right, well, until next time, y'all take it easy now, okay?